Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, business, and recreation. This week, Michael Birkner discusses his book, James Buchanan and the Political Crisis of the 1850s.
Michael Birkner, editor of James Buchanan and the Political Crisis of the 1850s. How is James Buchanan remembered today?
Well, he's remembered in different ways. I think he's remembered as a hometown hero in various places in Pennsylvania. By the historical community, he tends to be remembered as one of our less impressive presidents.
Now, you refer to him in your book as a supple politician.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, I think it means that he was a person of considerable political accomplishments. He was a person who could present himself effectively, and he did not necessarily come down very hard on all issues, so that he had some maneuvering room as a politician. He wanted to get some things done, and he knew that you often get things done in the center, talking on to both sides, if not necessarily out of both sides of your mouth. And he was viewed as more of an operator than a person who was highly principled.
Was he good at it?
Yes. As I argue in the introduction to the book, one of the things you have to say about Buchanan, whether you like him or not, is he was highly successful as a politician. Only 41 people have gotten elected president of the United States. He was one of them. That speaks for itself. But think about his career. Think about the offices he held. He was a state representative. He was a congressman. He was a United States senator. He was an ambassador both to Russia and to Great Britain. He was Secretary of State, and he was president. You have to be pretty good to get those jobs.
What skills did he have that made him a good politician?
I think you start with basic intelligence. It's clear if you study Buchanan that everybody agrees he's a bright man. Even people who don't like him respect him for his basic intelligence. He's got political skills, which he develops over time because he's committed to this world. He's a lawyer, right? In the 19th century, the great majority of lawyers played or practiced politics some of the time. Some of them, like Buchanan, wanted to use the law as a springboard into a political life. He had the skills, I think, from the beginning to be successful on a local level in Lancaster County, anywhere really in Pennsylvania that he had wanted to set up shop. The question for any politician is how high can you go? What are your talents going to be adapted to? He found out by going to Washington that he could play that political game. Now, he had some missteps in Washington. He fumbled around a little bit in the 1824 presidential election, but he learned some lessons from his missteps. He became more supple and canny. He didn't show his cards as often up front right away. I think the general answer to your good question, though, is that Buchanan knew how to work with people. He had the intelligence to read a bill and to understand the intricacies of legislation and log rolling in legislation. And he was a person also who was a hail fellow well met. People liked his company, liked sharing a drink with him.
He was good in social situations?
Absolutely, very good in social situations. You have to picture this man who's sort of a heavy-set fellow, although I gather from various sources he was quite light on his feet despite his bulk, who enjoyed a good glass of Madeira and something stronger sometimes, who would have a cigar in his hand, who loved the time that you spent outside in the tavern, outside of the legislative halls in the tavern, having small talk. He was particularly amiable with women, but he enjoyed male friendship as well.
Was it at all significant that he was a bachelor?
In terms of his political career, I don't think it's terribly significant. I think it's just one of those things. I really can't get inside of James Buchanan's head. I don't know that anyone has ever done that. We have, as far as I'm concerned, the best imagination of what Buchanan was going through in terms of his personal life through novels by John Updike. The most notable being one with the unusual title of Memories of the Ford Administration, which is actually a double story about someone who lived in the Ford era in the 1970s as a college professor who was writing a biography of James Buchanan and who tries to imagine what it was like to be young James Buchanan and then later President James Buchanan. And he has an imaginative way, Updike does, of capturing what Buchanan might have been thinking and feeling at different stages in his life. But historians haven't done as well.
It says in the book that he had a reputation for being faithless to friends. Is there an example of that you can think of?
I think that the person who made that statement in the book was referring to his failure to reward one of his very close collaborators in the 1856 presidential election, a man named John Forney, who you could argue really made it possible for Buchanan to win the presidency. The 56 election was an extremely closely contested election, and Pennsylvania was the kingpin state. It would determine probably whether John Fremont or Buchanan was elected president, or whether the election was thrown into the House of Representatives, because it was a third-party candidate that year. John Forney was a newspaper editor, an ally of Buchanan. He really spent as much as a human being could spend of his own money. He worked very hard day and night to get Buchanan elected, and he got Buchanan the votes of Pennsylvania by a very narrow margin. And Buchanan didn't give Forney very much for all of his efforts, and Forney was very bitter about it. And I think that may be the reference. In terms of his overall life experience with people, I think generally he was a very good friend to people. People liked him. He would not have been considered a double dealer on the whole.
You also say in your introduction to the book, like him or not, he was a formidable figure.
Yes.
And he doesn't necessarily have a historical reputation as being formidable. How was he formidable at the time?
Well, I think that we have to separate, to some degree, historical analysis of Buchanan and the secession crisis, or Buchanan and the controversy over Kansas during his presidency, from the overall texture of his political career. I think my answer before about the overall shape of his career is relevant to an answer to your question now. I mean, this is a man who succeeds. He doesn't get beat when he runs for office. He's forced to be considered for the presidency in 1844, 1848, 1852, and then gets the prize in 56. He has to be formidable, or he would not be in Polk's cabinet as Secretary of State. You know, he would not be Minister to England under Pierce.
Let's do a little biographical background of him. Where was he born?
He was born in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. His father was Scotch-Irish and was a successful local merchant. Grew up, I think you'd say, in comfortable but not opulent circumstances in Mercersburg. Went to Mercersburg Academy, and then went on to Dickinson College as a young man, and spent some happy and not happy times at Dickinson College.
He was kicked out of Dickinson for
yes,
a time?
He was. Again, we don't have lots of hard evidence about his early life experience or his years at Dickinson, but I think you could make a couple of generalizations fairly confidently. One, he was smart, and he was somewhat exuberant, and you could argue he was somewhat arrogant. As kids between the ages of 18 and 22 might be, he was sowing his oats, and he wanted to see just how far he could go. I think he got on the nerves of some of the administrators at Dickinson College, and he said something or did something, we're not clear what, that got him kicked out of the college, and he was only reinstated because a local man from Mercersburg, who was on the Dickinson Board of Trustees, put in a good word with the president, and they gave him a second chance.
You say he was never a terribly loyal alumnus?
Yes, he was a bitter alumnus for a while, not because he'd been kicked out and then reinstated, but because when he graduated, he had a very good record at Dickinson College, and he had friends who he thought also were bright and deserved reward, and he pressed very hard with the president that they should get the highest honors, he and his closest friend, at Dickinson in the year they graduated. And for reasons that aren't very clear, the administration took umbrage at his advocacy, which may have been a little bit, again, too much of a push. And they didn't give him the honors, and they didn't give his friend the honors. And he went out of Dickinson with a bitter taste in his mouth. Now, to finish the story off, I should say that Buchanan has nothing to do with Dickinson College directly for many, many years while he's setting up a law practice and developing a political reputation in Lancaster. But midway through his career, there are some initiatives made to get him interested in Dickinson again, and he's asked if he would settle a dispute at the college, and he agrees to do that. And we have evidence that he became much more friendly toward Dickinson College in the later years of his life, although in truth his interest was much more in Franklin and Marshall College, which was in his own bailiwick.
Did he go to law school?
No, in those days you didn't go to law school, you read law. And that's how he winds up in Lancaster. He reads law, and you don't get a formal degree in law. What you do is you read it for a certain number of months or years, and then when your mentor decides that you're ready, you will be examined by local lawyers who will then certify that you're able to practice law. And you make formal petitions to be admitted to the bar.
Are you still allowed to read the law today?
That's a good question. My guess is that it's much more formalized now, and that in a few states it may be possible, but I'm suspecting in most states in the United States it's not possible to get a law degree at admission to the bar that way.
Now, when did Buchanan first get into politics?
Well, he got into politics during the War of 1812. The interesting thing about Buchanan, of course, is that his first political allegiance is as a Federalist, and he's in effect a rat joining a sinking ship, because what you have is a Federalist Party that is in decline after the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, and Buchanan allies with the Federalist Party and is elected to office for the first time as a Federalist, and remains in some mild way aligned with the Federalist Party into the 1820s, when it gradually dies out and is replaced.
What office?
Well, he's elected to the local legislature, and then he's elected to Congress, and he serves in Congress for, I think, 3 terms, and then he makes the bid for the United States Senate in 1824, at a time when party allegiances are still being reformed in the wake of the election of 1824. What had happened was the Federalists died out sort of in infamy because they had opposed the War of 1812. And everybody claimed to be a Republican thereafter, except Buchanan, one of the few who could still identify as a Federalist and get elected to office. And when there was a new presidential race in 1824, basically the deck was reshuffled. And Buchanan aligned himself with Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, who would become, of course, the great father of the Democratic Party as we know it.
Now, he became a force in Pennsylvania politics, was the head of a faction.
Yeah, I mean, that's well put, actually, because what Pennsylvania politics is almost like Chinese politics. It's a bunch of warlords fighting it out, and factionalism is exactly the word to use to describe the Pennsylvania political universe. Part of it, I think, has to do with the Pittsburgh-Philadelphia axis, and the fact that the people who are locally powerful in Philadelphia have no say in Pittsburgh and vice versa, and the two sides are always seeking to get advantage over the other. Buchanan, being in the center of the state, was not caught up in those kinds of rivalries. I think that helped him. But what he does is he goes to the legislature and he gets known as a man who can do business and do it well. And also being likable is a great asset, no matter what generation you're talking about in politics. If someone is a bad news character or just plain dull, they're not likely to get as far.
Who were his adversaries?
Probably the principal adversary he had in Pennsylvania politics over many years was a figure named George Mifflin Dallas. George Dallas is best known today as a vice president of the United States. He served James K. Polk as vice president. Polk, Dallas, and the Tariff of 1844 was the great war cry of the Democrats that year. Dallas and Buchanan, as I see them, were people who were too much alike to get along. And they each had national ambitions, and it was inevitable that they were going to collide. And it's very interesting to watch these parallel careers, because they're almost like wrestlers who are sort of trying to get the edge for the takedown against their adversary. It happens they were both Democrats, and that makes it more interesting, I think. It doesn't appear that their rivalry particularly impeded either of them. Buchanan is elected president, Dallas is vice president, and I suppose it could have been reversed because their talents are roughly comparable.
Now, at some point, Buchanan is appointed minister to Russia.
Yes.
Under what president?
President Jackson, and that leads to a wonderful story. I'm not sure whether it's true, but as I mentioned earlier, Buchanan had decided in 1824 to put his political chips in with Andrew Jackson, who was running for president against John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, who was running against William Crawford of Georgia, and John C. Calhoun, briefly, of South Carolina. Calhoun drops out early on and winds up becoming vice president, and then finally Henry Clay of Kentucky. Buchanan aligns with Jackson. He makes some statements about vote buying, in the 1824 election that come back to haunt him and actually hurt Jackson's cause when the election comes to the House of Representatives. Jackson, frankly, doesn't trust Buchanan, doesn't think he's a reliable ally. Nonetheless, Buchanan remains a Jackson man, supports him and works hard for him in 1828, and when Jackson is elected that time, he owes Buchanan something. And so the story is that he sends him to Russia as partly as a reward, but partly as a punishment. As someone asked Jackson, allegedly, why did you send Buchanan to Moscow or St. Petersburg? And Jackson says, well, I couldn't think of any place further away to send him. So there is a kind of tension between the great leader of the Democratic Party and this young rising on the rise politician. The thing is that's interesting is that Buchanan actually served his country very well in Russia, had a good relationship with the Tsar, and didn't hurt himself at all being in Russia for several years.
How long was he there?
He was there about 3 years.
What did he do when he came back?
Ran for the United States Senate. That was always his goal. And he got, in those days, of course, you didn't run for the Senate the way you do today by getting political action committees to support you and then going out and using the media to splash your name out there. It was an inside kind of game because the legislature elected United States senators. What he had to do was win enough senators and representatives within the Pennsylvania legislature to get him elected to the United States Senate. He had to, in effect, outmaneuver Dallas and some of the other people at that time who were powerhouses in Pennsylvania, and he did it. And again, it's a sign that this man knew how to play politics. And he goes to the Senate for, I guess, 10 years. And he's, by all accounts, a formidable senator, a person who is not the kind of person who's going to bring bills up every day that are going to be called the Buchanan bill, but who knows how to play the game of politics, knows who to side with, knows when to show his cards and when not to show them.
Who did he side with?
Well, he was a strict constructionist Democratic senator. What that meant was that he was for frugal government, which made him a good ally of President Jackson and President Van Buren, both of whom wanted that. And frankly, he was a good friend of the South. The only way in which Buchanan really cannot support positions that Southerners are comfortable with is the tariff issue. The tariff issue is one of these issues that lasts practically the entire century as a major issue in American politics, and it's not intensely interesting in and of itself, but it has to do with putting a tax on manufactured products. The manufactured products presumably will be manufactured in the United States because of these tariffs, keep foreign goods out, but it means that the consumer is going to pay a little bit more for the products. So it's not surprisingly Southerners who are not engaged in industry don't want tariffs. Buchanan is representative of an emerging industrial state. He's got to support some tariffs. And so that's the one area in which he and his Southern friends are not going to see eye to eye. But on an issue like slavery, Buchanan is very friendly to the South.
And what kind of slave-related issues came up while he was in the Senate?
Well, the first kind of issue that comes up is one of these indirect issues. I mean, nobody is calling in the Senate in 1835 for the abolition of slavery. It's sort of the third rail of politics at that time. And also, abolitionism itself is, at best, a nascent movement. It is not a mainstream movement in American society. Nobody really, in middle-of-the-road politics, believed anything other than the Constitution protected slavery where it was. The issue that Buchanan has to deal with relates to gag rules. Are anti-slavery people allowed to give petitions, submit them to the Congress for consideration, just so they can have debate over slavery? And what John C. Calhoun and the Southerners, at least the radical Southerners, say is no, they can't even give these petitions to the Senate. We're going to table them. And of course, Northerners didn't say you're tabling them, you're gagging us. It's the gag rule. And Buchanan here has an interesting role because he really wants not to be seen as, quote, pro-Southern. He's got to be in favor of free speech for these anti-slavery people. So what he does is he tries to have it both ways, and he says, I think the abolitionists are terrible, but I also am opposed to gagging them. And that way he can talk to either audience and make it clear he's on their side.
And he served as Secretary of State for a time.
Yes, he did.
Under President Polk.
Yes, he did.
And you have I want to read from your book here. You say, in the part that you wrote, at one point, Polk wrote of Buchanan that the man who was supposedly his key advisor was in truth the enemy within. Buchanan has been, quote, has been selfish, and all his acts and opinions have seem to have been controlled with a view to his own advancement, so much so that I can have no confidence or reliance on any advice he may give upon public questions. Was he really like that?
If you're asking was Buchanan really like that, I'd back up and simply say this is Polk's perception of Buchanan. It gives you an idea. This was not an ideal partnership. It's very hard to know how to understand the Polk-Buchanan relationship except in terms of really hardball politics. Buchanan was a person from the North who was acceptable to Southerners because he was not a hardcore anti-slavery man, not at all. He was, as I said, he was very talented. He had diplomatic experience in Moscow. He would give weight, as they would put it, to the Polk administration. You asked the question, was Buchanan the things that Polk said he was? If you're saying, was he ambitious and self-interested, he has to plead guilty. But if you're saying, was he more ambitious and self-interested than the average person who was serving in Washington at that time, then the answer is no, he wasn't. I think Polk saw Buchanan as perhaps too openly interested in the presidency, and Polk may have wanted to keep his options open for 1848 and saw Buchanan as a potential rival. Very hard to read that. Now, Polk only runs once, does not run in 48, partly because he was so worn out by the rigors of the job.
You said that Buchanan was considered for the presidency or vied for it in 44, 48, 52, and 56. Can you run down those and say what the circumstances were?
Sure. 44 is clearly what you'd call just a trial balloon year. He had no real serious expectation of being the nominee of the Democratic Party in the year 1844. But the Democratic race was wide open that year because President Van Buren had been defeated in 1840 for re-election, and the president who was elected that year, Harrison, had died 1 month into his presidency. The man who succeeded Harrison, John Tyler, was a renegade Democrat nominated to give balance and strength to the Whig ticket and was unacceptable to the Whigs. The situation politically in 44 thus was very fluid. Buchanan just figured, let me put my name out through a few friends like J. Glancy Jones, a congressman from Pennsylvania, who was sort of an operative for Buchanan. Get his name out, just see what kind of response. And the response people gave was actually surprisingly positive. It was, this Buchanan guy has what it takes, but he's a little young yet. And so consequently, when the 1844 nominations were made, we don't get a Buchanan presidency, we get a Polk presidency. By 48, he's clearly much more interested in it. And in 48, what happens is that a man named Lewis Cass of Michigan comes up with an idea that Buchanan is kicking himself for not coming up with, and that is the idea of popular sovereignty on the slavery issue. And this has a great ring to it. The Democrats can sell themselves as being in favor of popular sovereignty both in the North and the South. In the North, people are going to think that means anti-slavery, and in the South, they may think it means pro-slavery. And I think you could just say that Cass got to the slogan faster than Buchanan did. Buchanan ran with the idea of dealing with the slavery issue by running the Missouri Compromise line all the way to California and to the Pacific, which itself was at least plausible but not politically attractive.
What did popular sovereignty mean?
That's a good question. Popular sovereignty meant many different things. It could mean, at the most basic level, that the citizens of a particular territory and then a particular state could decide for themselves whether they wanted to have slavery within the borders of that territory or state. One of the complexities of popular sovereignty is, when do you let people decide what they want? Is it when a territory organizes as a territory? Is it during its territorial phase? Is it when it applies for statehood? This was a difference that mattered because the general understanding among Americans was once slavery got a foothold, it would be very hard or impossible to dislodge. And so Northerners felt popular sovereignty should mean that once a territory is organized, immediately there should be a ballot of all the citizens of that community, and they can decide whether they're going to have slavery or not. And politicians from the 1840s and 1850s played this arcane game, and not very satisfactorily in the end.
So, election of 1848, who was elected?
Well, in 1848, Lewis Cass was the Democratic nominee. He was the popular sovereignty advocate. But he lost the election to a war hero, Zachary Taylor, who was a Whig. Taylor was one of these characters, we've had 2 or 3 of them in our lifetimes or in our experience as Americans, of people who are not particularly political, who are catapulted into political limelight by their war exploits. And Taylor had been the hero of Buena Vista in the Mexican War. He was willing to run on the Whig ticket. He had the beauty of being a man from a slaveholder from Louisiana who had many friends in the North and whose political views were strangely anti-slavery despite his status as a slave owner. And so he could appeal across the sectional divide, and he won a fairly convincing election in 1848 against Cass. And Buchanan is briefly, at least, in private life.
And 1852?
In 1852, Buchanan thought he had a really good chance to be president. I mean, he felt he was the class of the field. Cass was still interested, but Cass had lost once. Buchanan is out of the picture. He had run in 1848 as a spoiler candidate on the Free Soil ticket. So Van Buren is not a realistic candidate for the Democrats anymore. I think Buchanan was very disappointed when, instead of getting the nomination, he had to smile and pretend to be happy when the nomination went to a New Hampshire Democrat named Franklin Pierce. Now, you might ask, why does Pierce get the nomination and not Buchanan? Was it that Buchanan was a poor politician? No, it wasn't that. A lot of it is timing. The Democrats had lost the election of 1848 to a war hero. So what are they looking for in 52? They're looking for somebody who's got good credentials. Pierce, who had been an undistinguished senator from New Hampshire, had the virtue of having been a general in the Mexican War. Now, the Whigs like to say the only thing he did during the war was fall off his horse, but in fact he was a general. And so that, combined with his dough-faced political views, the fact that he had substantial experience in Washington, suggested he would make a good presidential candidate. Because in those days you didn't have presidential debates, at least not then. So they could simply use the media apparatus that was in place at the time to make Pierce out to be another Zachary Taylor.
What is a dough face?
A dough face in the standard lexicon is a northern man with southern principles. And it's a person, for example, who comes from New York or Connecticut or New Hampshire or Pennsylvania, who is sympathetic to the South's needs in terms of slavery and slavery-related issues. It's obviously meant as a term of derision rather than a term of accolade. Buchanan would not have liked it if I had sat here and called him a dough-face. But both Buchanan and Pierce are known in every textbook you'll ever read about the presidency or about American political history, are known as dough-face presidents because neither of them took strong stands against Southern interests or slavery during their presidencies.
Did Buchanan have a role in the Pierce presidency?
It's an interesting role. Buchanan clearly was entitled to some major post if the Democrats were elected in 1852, because he played a good soldier. He campaigned for Pierce. Pennsylvania went for Pierce in 52. Pierce owed Buchanan something. I think Buchanan would have liked to have been Secretary of State again, but Pierce had promised the job to a New York Democrat named William Marcy. And so then Buchanan was basically told, what do you want? And he thought about it, and he thought about it, and he realized there was a lot of storms brewing in the country over the slavery issue. It might be a good idea to be out of the United States. And so he took the best diplomatic position available, minister to England. And I think he had 4 pretty happy years, or close to 4 years, in London.
And he came back and ran for president?
He came back and ran for president, and it was, of course, the smartest thing he did, because what happened was that the Pierce presidency imploded over the Kansas-Nebraska issue, as President Pierce did something that he probably, in retrospect, shouldn't have done, and that is he not only amended but discarded the Missouri Compromise rule and said that slavery could actually go above the line that the Missouri Compromise had provided for, 3630, as we learned in our high school texts, if the people voted to let it go in that line. Now, as it happened, there was a territory out in the Midwest, Kansas, that was just on the point of organizing for territorial status. And Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, along with President Pierce, pushed to allow Kansas to work on the popular sovereignty principle. Pierce used the powers of the presidency to get that bill through. Douglas, of course, was a terrific legislator and a terrific speech maker, and he pushed hard for it. But the downside of the Kansas-Nebraska law is that it roused anti-slavery opinion in the North. As they said, wait a minute, we had a rule here that said no slaves above 3630. Now they're opening the gates to slaves above 3630. Something's rotten. And then you get the situation where Northerners run off to Kansas and Southerners run off to Kansas trying to get a majority in Kansas in order to claim that state either for freedom or slavery. Where's Buchanan in all this? He's safely tucked away at Grosvenor Square in London and meeting with the high principals of the British government and the royalty. It's a great position to be because he doesn't have to take a stand.
Did he have much opposition for the nomination in 1856?
He had some opposition for the nomination in 1856, but it was a pretty easy nomination for him. I mean, he was the most logical candidate for the Democrats. Why was he the most logical candidate? The Republicans in 1856 were now a party organized to challenge the Democrats for the presidency. In the ashes of the Whigs, in the wake of Kansas-Nebraska, in the wake of the caning of Senator Charles Sumner over a speech he made about Kansas, there was a roused Northern public opinion. Some people feared, particularly prominent Democrats, feared that the Republicans might sweep the entire North, and because the Republicans the North had more population, almost double the population of the South, more than double if you don't count the Southern slaves. If you get a politician who carries every Northern state, that politician can be president without a single vote out of the South. You needed to have a candidate, in other words, who came from the North on the Democratic ticket in 1856, but could appeal to Southern voters. Buchanan fit the bill. Longtime doughface, many friends in the South, conservative on constitutional issues, conservative on slavery, conservative on economic issues as a good Democrat. He was the natural candidate. And of course, he had the political experience to be able to say, I can do this job. I've got the resume.
Who did he run against?
He ran against a former president as well as a former hero of this country in the Mexican War and a pathfinder, John Charles Fremont. Everybody knows, I think, about John Charles Fremont's exploits as a pathfinder. Some know about him as a military figure in the Mexican War in California. But what I guess relatively few people realize is that he was the first candidate of the Republican Party for president. He was only about 39 years old at the time, very dashing figure, and he was a popular candidate. Buchanan would run against him, and he would run against Millard Fillmore, who had served out the rest of Zachary Taylor's term. Fillmore was a former Whig, a moderate on slavery issues, and in many ways very similar to Buchanan in his political outlook. But what he was going to do was to try to unite old-line conservatives who feared for the Union with young, rowdy nativists who didn't like immigrants and Catholics, and put together a coalition and sneak in and grab the presidency.
The Know Nothing Party?
Yes, although they wouldn't call themselves that. They called themselves the American Party. But history knows them as the Know Nothing Party because when people would ask them what their views were about immigrants or whether they had ever actually hurt immigrants or intimidated immigrants, they'd say, I know nothing. And that's how they got the name.
So how was the result?
Well, the result was tight as could possibly be. Fremont, just as expected, was a very strong candidate in the North. Buchanan won the election by a narrow but convincing margin by carrying 5 northern states and most of the southern states as well. I believe he carried virtually every southern state. Fremont, needless to say, did not get many votes south of the Mason-Dixon line. Buchanan needed to carry Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Illinois to win the election, and he carried them. And that's how he got elected president. Many people in the South said that if Buchanan were not elected president in 1856, they would secede from the Union rather than accept Fremont and the black Republicans in power. And so that was a great impetus for many people to vote for Buchanan because he promised a stable leadership in America that was still united and perhaps somehow a resolution of this festering issue of slavery.
I want to ask you a little bit about yourself. You are a professor at Gettysburg College.
Yes.
Can you talk about the college a little bit?
Absolutely, I'm happy to. Gettysburg is one of the many strong liberal arts colleges in the United States, one of a group that are associated together in central Pennsylvania, the Central Pennsylvania Consortium schools, Gettysburg, Dickinson, and Franklin and Marshall. Each of them schools of about 2,000 students, each of them stressing liberal arts, and each of them, I think, very distinguished in their own way. Gettysburg, needless to say, plays a bit on its access to the battlefield, and history is an important discipline at Gettysburg and a popular discipline, and so it's a very nice department to be able to teach in as a historian.
What do you teach?
I teach American history, and I teach historical methods, which is a foundation course in history at Gettysburg to try to get students acquainted with the discourses of history as well as the methodology of history in the 1990s. It's a foundation course that enables them to go on and learn how to do what they need to do to succeed in the rest of their courses. In terms of the substance I teach courses on 20th century America before World War II and since World War II, and I teach a seminar on Dwight D. Eisenhower and his presidency. It's a lot of fun. The students are very interested, and we have access to wonderful resources at the college to get students to work with the primary documents.
How long have you been there?
I've been at Gettysburg since 1989.
And you have a background as a journalist?
I did spend time as a journalist. It's sort of a long and complex trail to get me to Gettysburg, in that when I graduated from college, I expected to go to Columbia Journalism School and become a journalist. I had been very involved in college as a journalist, and then I'd gotten a Wall Street Journal fellowship and worked as a journalist for a summer in my junior year and enjoyed that immensely. And I thought I'd get a master's degree in history as just sort of some background before I went into journalism. But as life has a way of doing, I got momentum, and when I went off to graduate school, I enjoyed the history I was doing and the friends I had made, and I just stayed on and got a PhD. And then, with a PhD, you begin to think, well, do I really want to be a journalist if I've put all this labor into writing a doctoral dissertation? And I went into academics and taught for several years, became a journalist through the back door, when in the 1980s my wife was at Dartmouth College and I was at Dartmouth College, and my contract had run out, and I had to decide what to do next. And I didn't want to force my wife to make a move she didn't want to make. And just by the luck of the draw, the Concord Monitor, a very fine newspaper in the capital in New Hampshire, was looking for an editorial page editor and writer. And they interviewed me, and to my great luck, they offered me the job. And so I did that for several years.
And you've written other books?
Yes, yes. This is, the Buchanan book, I guess, is my fifth book. My first book was a revision of my doctoral dissertation. It was a biography of a man Buchanan would have known very well but not liked very much, because the man who was the political leader of New Jersey's Whig Party and a United States Senator for many years, his name was Samuel Southard. He was a foe of Buchanan's, and they would have probably had a cigar and a drink together, I suppose, in Washington, but there wasn't as much fraternizing between the parties as there may be now. So I wrote a biography of Southard. I did a book on the governors of New Jersey with a friend of mine. We edited a collection of essays about the governors of New Jersey from the colonial time right up to the 1970s, which was a great deal of fun. And I've also written a book that was a history of my hometown, and that was a lot of fun to do because it enabled me to revisit my early days and my old acquaintance and to make some sense of the life I had grown up with.
Where's your hometown?
It's in northern Jersey in Bergen County, right outside of New York City. The town is called Bergenfield. It tends not to be well known, but it is surrounded by communities like Hackensack and Englewood and Tenafly, which are a little bit better known outside of the North Jersey area. Unfortunately, the only claim to fame the town really has, aside from its band playing in the Macy's Day Parade every year, is that they had some mass suicides of teenagers in the 1980s, and for about 3 or 4 weeks that was a front page news story around the nation, as well as something that Dan Rather and the networks covered quite closely. And that was one of the tougher things I had to write about in the book.
You're listed as editor of this book. What's the difference between being an editor and a writer of a book?
Well, it's a big difference. I mean, an editor has an easier job because a chunk of the book is not coming out of his or her hide. You know, when I wrote the books from scratch, they were mine from start to finish. Here, a lot of the interpretations that are in this book are not mine. They're the interpretations of the distinguished scholars who contributed to it. So, as you know, we've got several essays by leading historians. We've got a panel discussion from some superb historians on Buchanan's presidency, and then I've just written some introductory material to try to set things in context about Buchanan. But it's less work. The only harder part of editing a book I think, is dealing with the different personalities and egos that you're dealing with when you try to edit their copy.
Did you decide what authors went in and which ones didn't?
Right. The book itself stems from a conference that was held in commemoration of the 200th anniversary of Buchanan's birth in 1791. And we invited, the people at F&M who organized the conference invited some really distinguished scholars to come. And I was asked if I would edit a volume that came out of it if the quality of the presentations was high enough. And after the program was done, we decided that it was indeed worth trying to collect the best papers, and that's what we did.
Who asked you?
Well, I was specifically asked by the assistant to the president at Franklin and Marshall College, named David Stemeshkin. Stemeshkin himself is a fine historian who has spent most of his career in academics working as an administrator. And he was the person who was really the point person to make this conference succeed. He brought me into it, and I really owe him a lot because not only did he ask me to be part of this, but he was an extremely good grantsman. He got money out of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, which helped fund the conference and helped subsidize this book.
And it's published by Susquehanna University Press?
Yes, it is.
Who are they?
Well, Susquehanna University Press is part of a network of publishers that are associated with something called Associated University Presses, about 13 academic presses. Bucknell University, Lehigh University, Fairleigh Dickinson University, University of Delaware, a number of other prominent schools have presses, and Susquehanna in the last few years has added itself to that list.
Now, getting back to President Buchanan, now President Buchanan, it says in here, his goal as president, and this is quoting Buchanan, is to arrest, if possible, the agitation of the slavery question at the North and to destroy sectional parties. What was the slavery agitation in the North?
Well, there were two kinds of slavery agitation in the North that I can immediately think of. The first slavery agitation in the North is called free soil, and that is to prevent any further expansion of slavery in the West. That was the mainstream position of the North in the 1850s, certainly among people who identify with the Republican Party. It was, look, the Constitution protects slavery as it is, but darn it, we're not going to let any more slaves go into the Western territories because all it'll do is bottle us working people up in the North, and we'll have trouble in the North because people won't have the same opportunity. The other slavery agitation that's referred to clearly is abolitionism. And abolitionism, which took many forms, has its central thesis was that slavery ought to be abolished, and it ought to be abolished immediately. And that, of course, was a radical point of view, not held by more than 3 or 4% of the population in the year, say, 1857.
Were these reasonable goals?
Were these reasonable goals? I mean, if you're talking in terms of principles of human rights, clearly abolitionism is a reasonable goal. But in the context of the time, I think it would have been considered to be very much an extremist point of view.
But Buchanan's goals for being president?
Buchanan's goals. They were reasonable from the point of view that Buchanan was coming from, and that is to say, a conservative Southern sympathizer who is trying to calm things down. If you want to peel this away a little bit more and say, was it reasonable in the sense of being feasible, calming the slavery agitation? I think not. I think there was too much going on. There was too much momentum toward increasing the cycle of bitterness between the North and the South. It would have taken a political genius to arrest that. And Buchanan was many good things, but he was not a political genius.
He also writes, if I can be instrumental in settling the slavery question and then add Cuba to the Union, I shall be willing to give up the ghost. And this is William Ginap. Ginap writes in here that he wrote this without comprehending that these goals were totally incompatible. First of all, why did he want to annex Cuba?
Well, that's a good question. Cuba, for him, represented a number of things. One, just the expanding glory of America. But I think he had this notion, somewhat far-fetched from our perspective, but not uncommon at that time, that if you sent more slaves to places like Texas and Cuba, there might be fewer slaves in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, that somehow there would be this sucking sound of slavery being sucked down away from the old South into the new South and into these new territories. I think he saw Spain as a decrepit colony, a decrepit empire with this colony in Cuba, and why couldn't we, a rising empire, grab it? Obviously, there are all kinds of political complications here because Northerners didn't want any part of another slave colony, much less a possible slave state. But Buchanan had always been known for his support for manifest destiny and expansion of the nation. If he was aggressive in any way politically, things like Cuba, Mexico, just in general, American expansion, Mexican War issue, he was associated with all of these things.
How did he operate as president?
How did he operate as president? Well, he wanted to be as collegial a president as he could be. And it's interesting you say that because one of the things that stands out about Buchanan is the degree to which he wants to be the head of a cabinet of people who actually deliberate together, who get along, and who govern together. And he sees this as a sign of his own maturity, that he doesn't want to be a dictator, that he wants to reason together with cabinet officers who share his goals and move the country, in his view, toward peace and prosperity. Now, in practice, this causes some tremendous difficulties for him because he picks people for the cabinet, I think, less on the basis of their abilities than on the basis of their congeniality to him. And that may not be the best basis on which to shape a cabinet. I would argue that his cabinet does not serve him well at all.
Who was in the cabinet?
Well, first off, you have to understand, he has mostly Southerners in the cabinet. And one of the reasons is, of course, to reward the South for having given him so many votes in 1856. But I think it's deeper than that, Brian. I think that it's psychological. Who are the people he drinks with most and spends most time with when you think about his Southern friends? Southerners. I mean, his friends in Congress or in Washington generally. He hangs out with Southerners. William R. King, a senator from Alabama, was probably his closest friend, indeed his roommate for a number of years in Washington. But the people he nominates to serve in his cabinet are often people he's socially friendly with. The most notable one being Hal Cobb of Georgia, who was a very rotund, pleasant 41-year-old in 1857 who became Secretary of the Treasury. And I would argue probably the only really good selection he made in the cabinet. There's a man named Jacob Thompson who's Secretary of the Interior. He's from, I believe, North Carolina. He's got several other Southerners. A man named Isaac Toucey is Postmaster General from Tennessee. No, I'm sorry, Toucey becomes Secretary of the Navy. Aaron Brown of Kentucky is Postmaster General. The only Northerners he's got in his cabinet are Jeremiah Black, who's Attorney General from Pennsylvania, who's an old political operator and ally of his, and a superannuated politician named Lewis Cass from Michigan, who by this time it was widely believed is almost senile. And the reason that Buchanan named Cass to the Secretaryship of State was twofold. One, he owed it to an old warhorse in the party to give him a nice job when Cass was losing his Senate seat. And secondly, he knew that Cass would be willing to let him run diplomacy. Cass basically made an agreement with Buchanan that he would take the Secretaryship of State and just handle the routine with the help of a secretary. Buchanan would steer the ship of state.
Buchanan was particularly interested in foreign policy?
Absolutely. I think that there's an analogy with Nixon there, much more interested in foreign policy than domestic policy. And the analogy goes further because while Nixon claimed to be mostly interested in foreign policy, if you look at his presidency, he's deeply involved in some really interesting and controversial domestic initiatives. Buchanan, for his part, gets sucked in and maybe even sucked down the drain on the domestic issues.
Now, the Dred Scott decision was made while Buchanan was president. What was the Dred Scott decision and what was Buchanan's role in it?
The Dred Scott decision was the beginning of Buchanan's undoing. The Dred Scott decision was a court case that had been wending its way up the court system to the Supreme Court even before Buchanan was elected. It involved an effort by a former slave named Dred Scott to get his freedom because his master had taken him from a slave state into free territory. And the question was, could the master reclaim him, hold him as a slave? Did a slave have the right to sue? The Supreme Court, under the leadership of a slave-owning Marylander named Roger Brooke Tawney, ruled in 1857 that Dred Scott had no rights that any white man was bound to respect. I'm quoting from the decision itself. Before Buchanan becomes president, the decision is still not handed down. In fact, it's going to be handed down in March of 1857. Coincidence here, Buchanan is going to be inaugurated on March the 4th. There is evidence that Buchanan began to poll some of the Supreme Court justices he was particularly friendly with, to see what the ruling would be and to encourage them to come down with a particular ruling. Now, historians disagree about what we actually know. Professor Philip Klein, who's written the best biography of Buchanan, argues that there was no tampering, that Buchanan may have spoken to several justices, but he didn't tell them what to do. How would he, want to do that? There's no question, though, that a president of the United States ought not be talking about an issue as explosive as this with Supreme Court justices before the decision is finally made. And he does do that. And in his inaugural address, he says to the American people, I have reason to believe that this great fiery issue of slavery is going to be resolved in a week or two by the Supreme Court, which will hand down a decision which we all ought to respect and which ought to settle the great sectional divisions. And the court, of course, does then issue the Dred Scott decision, but with a very different effect.
And Buchanan supported the court's decision?
Absolutely. He didn't just support it the way Dwight Eisenhower supported Brown versus the Board of Education, which is to say that privately, Eisenhower was very uneasy with that 1954 court decision which said no more segregation in public schools. But Eisenhower said, we have to uphold the law. This is what the Supreme Court says the law is, therefore I support it. What Buchanan is doing is making an emotional commitment to Dred Scott. To him, it's not just the supreme law of the land, it is the right decision. And so he's very vociferous in saying to the Northern public, don't agitate anymore. Dred Scott settles the issue. But you can't wave a wand at something like slavery and just say, all right, it's decided now because the Supreme Court voted by a majority vote that this is the way it's going to be. The Dred Scott decision, in fact, energized the Republican Party and gave Buchanan fits.
What was the Lecompton Constitution?
That was the big blunder of Buchanan's presidency by most standards. The only person I know who really doesn't agree with that is, again, Professor Klein, whose biography of Buchanan, which is first rate, is highly sympathetic to Buchanan. Buchanan had to deal with the issue of Kansas. Kansas had been an issue in '56 as Bleeding Kansas, which was a shorthand for the fact that Northerners and Southerners, pro-slavery and anti-slavery people, were fighting for power in Kansas. Kansas had not yet been organized to become a state because it didn't have the sufficient population, but it soon would. Buchanan thought that if he encouraged the admission of Kansas to the Union, that might end some of the disputation in Kansas, it might bring a democratic state into the Union, and it might help solve some of the problems of the slavery issue. And again, that blew up in his face because he was so eager to see Kansas admitted to the Union that he supported a constitution that was rigged, that was written by a distinct minority, a very tiny minority of ruffians, and that was a pro-slavery document. And by running roughshod over public opinion, both in Kansas and in Congress, that this was not a majority document, Buchanan sacrificed a lot of his political credibility.
He parted ways with Stephen Douglas over that?
Yes, that's the central fight of the Buchanan presidency. You're exactly right. Douglas looks at this Lecompton Constitution as it is forwarded to Washington to get Kansas admitted to the Union. The president says, these people met all the tests legally that they had to meet. They held a convention, they wrote a document, they put it up for referendum. The fact that the anti-slavery people wouldn't vote because they felt they'd been jobbed is not any concern of mine. The fact that a small percentage of the people of Kansas voted is not a concern of mine. The legal rights have been, the legal niceties have been adhered to. Douglas looks at it and says, you can call it anything you want, but I say it's spinach. It's not going to work because this is not a majoritarian document. And Douglas clashes with the president, breaks with the president, gives speeches against the president, and becomes the president's main foe in the Congress. Man from his own party.
It also says in here about Buchanan, his messages spewed out a continuous stream of invective against abolitionists and anti-slavery elements which alienated important sections of Northern public opinion. Buchanan believed that by defending the South, he was preserving the Union. Was he pro-slavery?
No, not in the literal sense. Buchanan had spoken publicly that slavery was a bad thing. How could he not, coming from Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania was not a rabidly anti-slavery state, but I think the general opinion in the state of Pennsylvania was that slavery itself was not a good thing. Buchanan would say that. But there's a difference between being anti-slavery in the abstract and anti-slavery on a practical basis. Buchanan was anti-slavery. Now think about that for a second. What he spent most of his career railing against was not the evils of masters lording it over slaves or lashing their property. What he spent much of his career railing against was abolitionist agitators who were trying to upset the local and the national political order. And to him, they were the bad guys, not the slave owners. You have to factor in, again, Buchanan grows up in an era where slavery was sort of acceptable. The Constitution ratifies slavery. He's a constitutionalist. He has many Southern friends. He listens to their point of view regularly. Many more Southern friends, I suspect, than New England friends. And it's easy for him to slip into a kind of anti-slavery mantra while saying at the same time that he's anti-slavery.
Now, it was during his presidency that South Carolina seceded from the Union.
Yes.
What was his response?
It was a varied response, and again, it's a delicate issue because much of what you say about Buchanan's response to the secession crisis of 1860-61 depends on your perspective on what should have happened, not what he could have actually accomplished. Let me simply say that his response was to say that secession was wrong and illegal, but at the same time that there was no responsibility, indeed no right, for the President of the United States personally or for any agent of the federal government to prevent secession. And this is, as you can see, a somewhat complex and difficult position to adhere to because you've got the practical matter of a broken union. Historians have been very harsh on Buchanan. And when you think about it a little bit, indeed, if you think about it a lot and look at the documents, it's hard to understand why they have been so harsh to him, except that they have a view of Buchanan that is based on his weakness and his errors earlier in his presidency. What would they have done in the wake of South Carolina's secession that would have been more useful? Had Buchanan tried to send an army to crush the secessionists in South Carolina in the fall of 1860 or January of 1861, what do you think would have happened? It's pretty easy to predict. Every state south of the Mason-Dixon line would have seceded from the Union. Remember, all the states don't secede simultaneously. South Carolina goes out first, and then Alabama and Mississippi go out a little bit later. But most of the upper South is hanging in the balance. They're not sure which way they want to go. Opinion is very divided in the South. Buchanan didn't want to break the Union any more than it had to be. He was hopeful somehow a resolution could come. I think in his heart he felt, even if I can't solve this problem, I don't want to make it worse for the next president. Let him deal with it. I think that's a normal reaction.
Is there anything he could have done any time in his term that could have averted the Civil War?
I think that if he had been sensible enough not to spend his political capital on Kansas and the way that he did, that he could have avoided some anger and bitterness that clearly cropped up. I think if he had been more even-handed in his overall assessment of the country and his leadership of the country from 1857 to 61, I think we might not have gotten to the pass we did. But now, having said that, I mean, to me, the key to the secession movement, Brian, is really the election of 1860. The only way you avoid secession in 1860 is if you elect a Democrat. You can argue, if you want to do a little what-if in history, that if Buchanan had not attacked Douglas, had not deprived Douglas of patronage, had not tried to basically stuff Kansas down Douglas's throat, and had supported Douglas, the most popular living Democrat in 1860 for the presidency, and that Douglas had won, we would not have had a Civil War in 1860. Maybe not. But certainly with a Republican in the White House, it was pretty much foreordained.
Now, it also says in here, by the time he became president at the age of 65, he was a political anachronism. This is again William Ginap. He was a political anachronism. He looked back to an earlier era of American politics when anti-slavery was disreputable, sectionalism was condemned, and the Northern majority was ready to make concessions to the South for the sake of the Union. He never appreciated how much the political situation had changed during the past few years. How had it changed?
Well, you had a whole series of movements in the country coming out of the evangelical revivals of the 18-teens, 1820s, 1830s, in which people were looked at the world from a much more, say, fundamentalist perspective than they did. You know, everybody wanted to reason together in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Reason was not the dominant motif in American politics and American culture in the years from 1820 to 1860. Buchanan cuts his teeth in an earlier era. He's very much a genteel character. I think he's not up to date with what's going on in the country. Now, Professor Knapp is particularly sharp in his rebukes of Buchanan. I would say that much of what he says is realistic and if not fair, certainly plausible. But you don't have to argue that Buchanan was completely out of touch to argue that Buchanan was not effective.
After all the studying you've done, do you like him?
Buchanan? Not particularly, no. I think that he's a person I respect for his ability to climb the greasy pole. And in politics, that's what matters in terms of judging somebody until they get to the presidency, and then they've got to show what they're made of. My feeling is Buchanan could have been a reasonably effective president if he'd been elected 2 decades earlier.
Here is the book, James Buchanan and the Political Crisis of the 1850s. Michael Birkner, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.